This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the 2024 Bard. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. In 2014, Bard was one of the most beloved classes due to its mechanical flexibility and its whimsical flavor. Like Cleric, it was a support class in the sense that it could fulfill a secondary position in almost any role, given that the player behind it was attentive to the party's composition. In 2024, Bard has mostly seen improvements across the board, becoming even more flexible as both a single-class caster and a multi-classing candidate. So to start, what's changed between D&D 2014 and 2024? First, the only real nerf to the Bard is that the base class loses proficiency with rapiers, longswords, short swords, and hand crossbows. As we'll get to, Valor Bard still offers a path to gain proficiency with these martial weapons, but as a default, the Bard base class only offers proficiency with simple weapons. Personally, I don't think this was a necessary change. Initially, when we saw it in the 1D&D playtest, my speculation was that they were trying to streamline a little bit more. And while it was annoying to write down the individual proficiencies of druids and wizards, I never found Bard to be overwhelming for any new player. I loved that Bards in 5th edition were reimagined as these magical swashbucklers. And I don't think personally that it was necessary, either from a flavor or functional standpoint, to remove these weapon proficiencies, but alas, that's the rules as written as we have it. Of course, this also presents a great time to remind all of you Dungeon Masters that if you preferred the proficiencies of 2014, as a DM, you're allowed to give your players access to them. There is a time and place to be strict with the rules as written, and for many tables, they're still going to be open and excited for a house ruling like this. And in terms of added complication, I find it's always easier to add things than it is to remove them. Telling a player that this option isn't available is more difficult than letting a player know, by the way, at my table, even though we're playing with 2024 rules, you can still take a rapier or hand crossbow on your Bard. Now on to all of the different buffs. First, Bardic Inspiration lasts for an hour rather than 10 minutes, and can be rolled after a creature knows whether or not they failed a D20 test. It can also be given to a creature that can see or hear a Bard, as opposed to just being able to hear them. In the playtest, there was an experimental version of Bardic Inspiration that triggered it on a reaction rather than a bonus action. Personally, I prefer the reaction version. The reason that we were told it was changed back was because survey respondents said they preferred the gameplay loop that they had gotten used to in 2014. Personally, I kind of like the stories that came out of the playtest version, like a Bard yelling "duck" to help an ally at the last minute as a reaction to quickly succeed a dexterity saving throw or something. I don't mind the bonus action version. I just really ended up liking the experimental version. Again, I could see myself homebrewing in the playtest version as an option, maybe when a Bard hits 5th level. Next up, Expertise, which in 2014 was gained at level 3, is now gained at level 2. As I've mentioned previously, skills carry a little less mechanical weight in 2024 than in 2014. There are still some skills like stealth and perception that are great candidates for expertise builds, but other major skills like athletics and acrobatics have been toned down to the point that skills for the most part are largely narrative rather than mechanical. Of course, this is also a purely rules as written assumption. Your DM may use skills differently, So even though the rules reference skills a little less often than they used to, it doesn't mean that you won't find a use for expertise. Now, Song of Rest, which was a feature that used to be gained at second level, has just been removed. This was one where I never thought it was a bad feature in 2014, but given the actual play trends of 5e games, where they're mostly narrative and there's usually 1 or 2 combats per long rest, this feature didn't tend to come up all that often. And I think it was one of those oh yeah features as opposed to something players would get really excited about. Let me know in the comments if you missed 2014's Song of Rest. Personally, I'd rather get expertise at level 2. At 5th level, we get Font of Inspiration. In 2014, this was the one that really let you just regain bardic inspiration on a short or a long rest. Now there's an additional little line that tells you can expend a spell slot to regain your use of bardic inspiration. Most of the time, I don't think that this is advisable. And kind of like how each barbarian subclass somehow enhances your rage, each bard subclass offers an alternative effect or some kind of boost to your bardic inspiration, like the lore bard's cutting words or glamour bard's mantle of majesty. At higher levels, when you have a whole lot of spell slots to choose from, it might make sense to burn a first level spell slot to use some of these effects, or to just increase an ally's chance to hit if an enemy has an unreasonable armor class anywhere north of 21. Counter Charm is now a 7th level reaction that lets an ally within 30 feet of you that failed a saving throw against Charm or Frightened reroll with advantage. In one of his videos, and I can't remember if it was within a larger video or its own video, YouTuber Treant Monk had a breakdown of why the 2014 version of Counter Charm was more often than not completely useless. This redesign as a reaction might be a little situational, but it's at least functional, and it doesn't completely negate the tension of a moment where an ally might become charmed or frightened. And moving around a little bit, at 20th level, Bards have a much better capstone. In 2014, the 20th level feature was universally panned. If you had expended all your bardic inspirations and you rolled initiative, it would give you a use back. Now instead, power word heal and power word kill are always prepared, and you can possibly target a second creature with each of them. Power word kill in particular was redesigned so that if a creature has more than 100 hit points, rather than the spell just fizzling, it at least deals 12d12 psychic damage, meaning it won't feel like you wasted a spell if you don't know the creature's exact hit points. Finally, the most ambitious change with the new Bard base class is Magical Secrets at 10th level. In 2014, it used to allow you to select any 2 spells from any list to add to your spells known, granted that you had the spell slots to use them. Well, now the designers wanted to protect class identity a little more by locking certain spells to certain classes, like Divine Smite for Paladins and Eldritch Blast for Warlocks. However, the Wizard, Cleric, and Druid spell lists are considered the universal spell lists, even though they don't have that official name. So Magical Secrets just lets you choose any spell from the Bard, Wizard, Cleric, or Druid list whenever your number of prepared spell increases, essentially giving you 4 full spell lists to choose from for your higher level spell progression. Now to clarify, this does not mean you can just go and replace all 16 spells that you have previously prepared with any spells you want from all 4 lists. It means that when you gain a new spell prepared by leveling up, you can choose from these 4 lists for the new spell only. In addition, each time you level up, you can swap one spell you have prepared with a spell from another list, meaning over time, you can end up with a character with a good number of spells from across different lists. It has its limitations, but it's still one of the most versatile and powerful features of any base class we've taken a look at so far. In 2014, there was a debate on whether Wizard or Bard was the strongest caster. Wizard had the benefit of having the most robust spell list and the highest number of spells known. However, even having a few wild card spells through Magical Secrets made Bards extremely appealing. And although Wizard ended up, for the most part, being recognized as the most powerful class, Bards were a close second. With this new version, I think that the gap is closer than ever. I'm not sure what's going to end up being the most useful class in play between Bard, Wizard, and Sorcerer. I think we'll discover it over the next year, and my instinct is the tier of play is going to matter. Magical Secrets isn't even gained until 10th level. So under 10th level, I do think that Wizard and Sorcerer are the more powerful classes. But once we get toward level 11 and up, where Bards can select any spells they want for their 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th level slots, and they get auto preparations of Power Word Heal and Power Word Kill, I don't know. We'll have to see. So, our big question, is Bard the right class for you? As usual, starting with complexity, Bard is undoubtedly a high complexity class. Its spells often make big differences in combat, and usually in indirect ways. For example, Fairy Fire potentially grants your allies advantage on their attack rolls against certain targets. This advantage increases your team's damage per round. However, for a new player, there's a lot of steps in between them casting Fairy Fire and then the team's eventual damage output calculation. So sometimes the spell doesn't feel as impactful as it usually is. With Bard, you kind of have to trust the bird's eye view math in order to understand the difference that you're making. Bards don't have a secondary budget like sorcery points to manage, but they do have to keep an eye on their limited supply of bardic inspiration. Bards are also a little more versatile than similar support classes like Cleric and Druid, meaning that to make the most of them, you need to understand combat's usual flow to fill the role turn by turn that's best needed in a situation. Sometimes this means moving off of healing into control, or off of spell casting into weapon use. Where I see most Bard players frustrated is when they imagine their character fulfilling a certain role, but then that role isn't the one that's needed by the party. I've seen some Bards take Valor, for instance, and always move into melee, when really the best thing to do would have been to cast a healing or a support spell. Or the opposite, where you get like a pacifist Bard, but the way the situation breaks down, the best thing to do, even though Bard isn't a great damage dealer, is to help contribute to damage. As I discussed with Cleric, to me, the role of support means helping the team in the way that makes the most sense, which I think the Bard potentially does better than the Cleric. They have a more diverse spell list than Clerics. In addition to being able to heal, they have Dissonant Whispers, a psychic damage spell with secondary forced movement that provokes opportunity attacks from allies. I have been both a dungeon master that has had Dissonant Whispers used against my monsters, and a player that's used it against an unsuspecting DM. And I can tell you, when used appropriately, especially against a brute melee-focused enemy, Dissonant Whispers can single-handedly shut down a combat. Heroism is a fantastic buff that also counters one of the most debilitating conditions in the game, which is Frightened. And of course, they get access to Cure Wounds and Healing Word. The 4 Bard subclasses also give their own unique secondary traits. So let's get into these subclasses, as usual, in order of simplest to most complex. For me, the simplest Bard is Valor. At 3rd level, it gives you proficiencies in medium armor, shields, martial weapons, and allows you to use weapons as a spellcasting focus. As boosts to bardic inspiration, a creature can roll the inspiration die as a reaction to increase its armor class, or add it as a damage roll to an attack. At 6th level, Valor gets extra attack, and it can replace one of its weapon attacks with a cantrip. Now, as of right now, this sounds a lot better than it is. Treant Monk did damage calculations for each of the major classes besides Wizard and Cleric. Valor Bard came in last. Assuming that you're using just the 2024 PHB, the best spell to use with extra attack is probably True Strike, maybe Vicious Mockery to impose disadvantage in combination with a weapon attack. This might be a little better if your DM allows you to use older spells like Green Flame Blade or Booming Blade, but I think it just goes to show how well the redesigned martials are in relation to where they were in 2014. That being said, I still like the design of the Valor Bard. You may have noticed from previous episodes, the subclasses that I tend to get most excited about are more complex ones, like Battlemaster Fighter, Wildheart Barbarian, and Circle of the Land Druid. However, I'm going to be playing a Valor Bard in a game this coming weekend, so I'll be sure to post in the Darkmoor Podcast discussion channel what my real play experience is like with it. After all, theoretical DPR calculations are just one narrow dimension of the TTRPG experience. We'll see what it's like in actual play. Next up is the Lore Bard. Unlike with Valor, which just grants some simple martial proficiencies, Lore requires a bit more mechanical knowledge from its player. You get 3 bonus skill proficiencies of your choice, meaning that you need to know which skills are better selections than others. Cutting Words is a decent alternative to Bardic Inspiration, allowing you to use a reaction to have your Bardic Inspiration subtract an enemy's damage roll, ability check, or attack roll. It requires some careful management with Bardic Inspiration, but as a DM, I've seen it save party allies more than once. At 6th level, Magical Discoveries is similar to the old version of Magical Secrets. You get 2 spells in any combination from the Cleric, Druid, or Wizard lists, and you need spell slots to cast them. Interestingly, the language is, quote-unquote, for which you have spell slots as shown in the Bard features table. With the old Lore Bard, you could create a cheesy multiclass where if you time it where your Magical Discoveries at level 6 Lore Bard, multiclasses with higher level spell slots, you could potentially get higher level spells than what your multiclassing should allow for. With this version, I don't think it's clear if you can still cheese it like this. My gut ruling is that a player has to use whatever spell slots are available to 6th level bards, as shown in the Bard features table. And that's how I plan to rule it at my table. Still, it's a pretty powerful feature, and requires some decent knowledge of the best Cleric, Druid, and Wizard spells to make the most of it. That being said, while I don't think it's as powerful, I do think that Glamour is a bit more complicated. It comes with automatic preparations of Charm Person and a Mirror Image, as well as the ability to force targets to make wisdom saves against being charmed or frightened after using a spell slot to cast an illusion or enchantment spell. Of course, after the first use, you have to spend Bardic Inspiration to force these effects. But these conditions can quickly turn the tides of combat if they land. In a lot of ways, College of Lore might be more customizable, and because of that, I think a lot of players would instinctively think that it'd be more complicated as a result. However, in actual play, I find that knowing when best to trigger a charm or frighten effect requires some experience and mechanical savvy, as while they're both very effective conditions to inflict, they're also common immunities among higher CR monsters and certain monster types. Not that players should necessarily know what each monster's resistances and immunities are, but rather, once you've been around the block a few times, you'll know that if you're fighting a Fae, you're probably not going to land Charm really easily, or if you're fighting a Fiend, probably not going to land Frightened. That being said, comparing this to the Xanathar's version, the redesigned Glamour is much more practical for what can actually come up at the table and deliver on the gameplay promise that's being presented. Finally, the most complicated subclass, in my opinion, is the new College of Dance, which seems to borrow some design from the Monk. You have advantage on performance checks involving dancing. You get an unarmored defense equal to 10 plus dexterity plus charisma modifiers, just like the Draconic Sorcerer. And you can use dexterity instead of strength for attack rolls using unarmed strikes. Now, just one thing to note, in the Monk's martial arts feature, it specifically calls out that the DC to shove and grapple also uses dexterity, while this language is missing from the Dance Bard, meaning that the dexterity substitution can only be used for attacking. Still, it's a neat subclass idea. What makes Dance complicated is that bards aren't great melee combatants. It's a really fun concept, and I think the design matches the flavor well, but I predict that it'll require a lot of mechanical finesse for a player to use well. In 2014, more often than not, I'd see monk players rush into melee only to get knocked to 0 quickly, because their multiple ability score dependency between dexterity, constitution, and wisdom meant they could either have a decent AC or decent hit points, but not both. And this problem exists with the Dance Bard. The biggest difference is that this is a side feature to a full caster. So if I think of it more as scaling unarmored defense on a ranged full caster, it's definitely more powerful. Now at 6th level, both inspiring movement and tandem footwork are interesting support features that revolve around positioning and initiative. I can see it leading to cool thematic and functional moments. From an optimizer's point of view, I can see why College of Dance would be easy to dismiss in terms of power. However, for clever players looking to use underutilized options, I can see Dance Bard being a fun, unexpected option that may take some DMs off guard. Like Sorcerer, because Bard is a charisma caster, it makes for an excellent multi-classing candidate. As a 1-level dip, Bard offers some excellent features right at 1st level. Taking spells like Healing Word, Dissonant Whispers, Fairy Fire, and Heroism are great for any class. And while the size of the Bardic Inspiration die is tied to your investments in Bard level, its amount of uses is tied to Charisma modifier. So you can continue to gain uses through the progression of another charisma-focused character. Bard also makes for a great base class that picks up levels of other classes. For example, a 2-level dip into Warlock gets Eldritch and Agonizing Blast. Like 2014, and this is not something I like, Eldritch Blast scales with character level, not class level, so it's a nice way to get a decent ranged cantrip option beyond Starry Wisp or Vicious Mockery. Eldritch Blast is also a great candidate for the Valor Bard's extra attack, since all the additional beams still count as one casting of the spell. And of course, Pact of the Blade offers you all the swashbuckling fun of the 2014 Bard, while allowing you to use your Charisma modifier for the attack and damage rolls, allowing you to better focus your ability score distribution. This multiclass used to be a little more popular. I don't think it's going to be quite as popular, but I still think it's valid, which is a Bard multiclass with Paladin. Now, at this point in D&D 2024's release, it is apparent that Divine Smite is much less strong than it used to be. Still, it only takes a 1-level Paladin dip to access it, and as a Bard, you'll have plenty of spell slots to fuel it. If you start your career as a Paladin, you'll also start off with heavy armor training, possibly yielding a beefier character than you would get by single-classing Valor Bard. Overall, I think Bard still has a great design that fulfills its core gameplay promise, while having 4 solid subclass options that each encompass one of its iconic expressions. Time will tell if the redesigned magical secrets ends up putting the Bard ahead of some of its spellcasting peers, even if it's in a specific level range. In any case, it should be an exciting kit for veteran players to customize a character that can fit almost any party composition. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage. a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, and the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.